So this unit we're going to cover the development of the Americas from 1200 to 1450. We have several large, highly elaborately developed civilizations in the Americas at this time. For instance, you have the Aztecs in Mesoamerica, the Mississippian mound builders in North America, and the Inca in South America. And all of them developed very elaborate, like I said before, cultures in which they had complex political systems, very large cities, elaborate religions. How many times can I use the word elaborate? Apparently, I think 4 times. But anyways, our current knowledge really is based on archaeological evidence, oral traditions, and those writings, like I said before. One poem is the one you find on this slide in the chat bubble. This was actually recorded by the Spanish, and it was from an Aztec writer. So as I said before, the history of the Americas is a complicated history. You know, for instance, most of our knowledge comes from archaeological evidence, dead languages that are still being translated today, and then by far the most sources we have over these civilizations are going to be from Europeans who, of course, conquered these civilizations. So right away you know that if it's coming from a European writer, perhaps they have an agenda. Their point of view is this particular civilization, will say the Aztecs was bad. We took over and we brought enlightenment to them. In reality, Europeans did not bring enlightened ideas to the Americas. What they did bring was a lot of diseases. And we're going to talk about this when we get to our section in a little while where we talk about Europe. But it bears mentioning that Europeans were kind of gross at this time, and they didn't have a lot of hygiene, and they had some diseases like smallpox and the plague and various other diseases that are going to ravage the Americas. So the first large-scale civilization in North America is known as the Mississippian culture. We call this the Mississippian culture because of where they were located. We have really very limited knowledge on their actual name or their origins, where they came from, even really kind of where they went when they disappeared. So it's a very mysterious culture, but the thing is they were a very creative culture. So as a result, we have tons and tons of artifacts. We also have these mounds that still exist today. For instance, on this slide, you're going to look at the bottom and you're going to look at that picture and think, what is that? That's actually a snake mound. It is huge. It's an aerial view. It still exists today. It's found in Ohio, and it's called the Serpent Mound State Park or Federal Park, I don't know, something Serpent Mound. So they still exist today. I happen to grow up outside of St. Louis, Missouri, and if you looked downtown across the river into Illinois, you could see this huge, huge hill. This hill is probably the largest mound that still exists today, and it is called the Cahokia Mound. By the way, I just got a new puppy, so you're going to hear some barking. In terms of government and society, the Mississippian society had a rigid class structure. A chief called the Great Sun ruled each large town. Below the Great Sun was an upper class of priests and nobles, and then a lower class of farmers, hunters, merchants, and artists. At the bottom were slaves, who usually were prisoners of war. In general, women farmed and men hunted. The Mississippians had what we call a matrilineal society, which means that the social standing was determined by the woman's side of the family. So, for example, when the Great Sun died, the title passed not to his own son, but to his sister's son. If he had multiple sisters, that would be the eldest sister's son. The decline of this culture is just one of history's mysteries. We don't know why they suddenly abandoned their large cities. We can only theorize that it was probably a combination of agricultural collapse or perhaps disease from Europeans. We're not even quite sure when. We can date the decline begins about 1450, and by 1600 they've left their cities. Why, we don't know, and if you can solve that mystery, a few academics will really love it. Other than that, no fame, none at all. All right, so here's this story of one of Oklahoma's connection to the mound builders. So there was many sites along eastern Oklahoma of the mound builders, especially along the Arkansas River, and especially in an area today we know as Spiro, Oklahoma. So the time is like the 1930s, and this is right after this huge craze in the 1920s of archaeological find. They found King Tut's tomb in the 1920s. So by the 1930s, everybody feels about, archaeology like it's just the latest, best thing, and everybody really wants artifacts from these old cultures. So enter a story from Oklahoma history. What happens is the 1930s, there are all these mounds. People have been finding arrowheads and shell-like jewelry for centuries going back. So it was known that this was a place where you could find it. So these two country guys, decide that they're going to go on this land, they're going to dig it up. They're going to dig up these mounds, see if they can find something worth selling. And they do. They start to dig in these mounds, and they suddenly find some stuff. And what begins now is really the looting of one of America's treasures. Those two country boys decide that they can't get to the treasure fast enough. They start disregarding bodies, throwing skeletons around. They just want the treasure. And as I said, this was a very artistic culture, so they had a lot of artifacts. Well, they just can't get to it fast enough, so one of them gets an idea. Why don't we get some dynamite? And yes, kids, they blew up one of the Spiro mounds. As a result, they completely decimated a lot of the history of the mound builders. And actually, I don't know how much they destroyed, but even now, 80% of all artifacts from this culture actually come from this region. So they must have destroyed a massive amount, because we're still left with a huge amount of archaeological evidence. But yeah, they did. I wish I could say it ended there with them dynamiting the site, but the next thing they did is, at this time, the main highway through the country went straight through Oklahoma. That highway today we know is I-40, and it just went straight across the country. It's a big traveling area. And so these boys set up a booth on the side of the highway and began to sell all the different artifacts. And that concludes this story today. So the Mayan civilization, or city-states, reached its height at around 250 CE to about 900 CE. Mayans stretched over the southern part of Mexico and much of what is now Belize, Honduras, and Guatemala. Most lived in or near one of the approximately 40 cities that ranged in size from 5,000 to 50,000 people. At its peak, as many as 2 million Mayans populated this region. So for most of history up into post-1950, what we knew about the Mayans was very little. They wrote extensively, they wrote all over their buildings, but we had no idea what their language was. We didn't have an alphabet, and we weren't able to translate it. It wasn't until the 1950s that they translated the Mayan language. So up until then, it was thought that the Mayans were just a peaceful, priestly society who was completely opposite than the evil Aztecs. And then their language was deciphered, and we found out that actually the Mayans did practice human sacrifice. They correlated that with the stars in the heavens, and we found out a lot about them, actually. So the main form of Mayan government was the city-state, each ruled by a king and consisting of a city and its surrounding territory. Most rulers were men. However, when no male heir was available or old enough to govern, Mayan women ruled. So also wars between city-states were common. At times, city-states were overthrown. However, Mayans rarely fought to control territory. More often, they fought to gain tribute, which is just payments from conquered kingdoms. And then they also fought to gain captives to be used in human sacrifices during their religious ceremonies. Each Mayan king claimed to be descended from a god. The Mayans believed that when the king died, he would become one with his ancestors. The king directed the activities of the elite scribes, who are writers, and priests who administered the affairs of the state. Royal rule usually passed from father to son, but kings who lost the support of the people were sometimes overthrown. The common people were required to pay taxes, usually in the form of crops, and to provide labor to the government. City-states had no standing armies, so when war erupted, as it usually did, government ruled all Mayan lands, although often one city-state was the strongest in the region and would dominate its neighbors. The Mayans were also innovative thinkers and inventors. For example, they incorporated the concept of zero into their number system, developed a complex writing system, and learned to make rubber out of liquid collected from rubber plants. Mayan science and religion were linked through astronomy. Based on the calendar, priests decided when to celebrate religious ceremonies and whether to go to war. I'm sorry about that long pause. I thought I had paused it, but I didn't pause it. I told you guys I'm really old, and so now I'm going to pause it again. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm kind of losing my voice, and I'm not recording well, and I apologize. I'll try to do better. So anyways, our Mayan science and religion were linked through astronomy, as I said before. It was based on a calendar, and priests decided when to celebrate religious ceremonies. And as a result, keeping an accurate calendar was very important. Although the Mayans had no telescopes, they made very precise observatories atop pyramids, such as the one at Chichen Itza. Their observations enabled priests to design a calendar more accurate than any used in Europe at the time. One task of the priests, who could either be male or female, was to conduct ceremonies honoring the many gods. Among the most important deities were those of the sun, rain, and corn. Mayans made offerings to gods so prayers might be answered. War captives were sometimes killed as offerings. So the Aztecs. Actually, the Aztecs were not native to the area they conquered. They originally were hunters and gatherers who migrated to central Mexico from the north in about the 1200s. We're not really sure about the origins of the Aztecs. There's many theories. Did they come from Canada? Were they related to the Comanches and, settled or started migrating to the south? There's even a theory that they were from Madagascar, the island off of Africa. That's a really far-fetched theory. I mean, there's also a theory that they're aliens. So, there's lots and lots of theories that fall kind of off the beaten path there. But in terms of their early history, we don't know. But we do know by 1325, they had founded their capital in Tenochtitlan. And this is the site of what is now modern-day Mexico City. Over the next 100 years, they conquered the surrounding people and created an empire that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. They actually built their capital city along a very large lake in the middle of really a swampy lake. And so they created these islands and built their capital city there. They did this in order to make it, their goal was to make it one of the largest cities in the world. And they did it also to provide water for the city. They built a network of aqueducts. At the center of the city, the Aztecs built a pyramid that rose 150 feet into the air. The Great Pyramid and other pyramids, temples, palaces were all made of stone. On Lake Texcoco, the Aztecs built floating gardens to increase the amount of space for food production. The Aztecs dug ditches to use lake water to irrigate their fields and to drain. They actually drained parts of the lake for more land. Okay, before I talk about government and economy, actually there over to the side is a picture of what the capital city would have looked like during the Aztec Empire, and then underneath that is a depiction by the Spaniards of an Aztec sacrifice. So as the Aztecs conquered much of Mesoamerica, they developed a tribute system that ensured their dominance. Conquered people were forced to pay tribute, surrender lands, and perform military service. Tribute included practical goods such as food, cloth, and firewood, as well as luxury items such as feathers, beads, and jewelry. The Aztecs allowed local rulers to stay in their positions to serve as tribute collectors. This allowed the Aztec political dominance without direct administrative control. In exchange, the conquered people were extended Aztec protection. To run this empire, the Aztecs grouped city-states into provinces. They moved warriors and their families to each province's capital to make sure the province remained under Aztec control. In addition, an Aztec official was stationed in each capital to collect tribute from local officials. Aztec government was what we call a theocracy, which is ruled by religious leaders. At the top was the emperor, known as the Great Speaker, who was political ruler as well as a divine representation of God. Next in the social hierarchy were landowning nobles, who also formed the majority of Aztec military leadership. Next in rank were writers and healers, followed by craftspeople, and then lastly traders. A special merchant class rose up that traded in luxury goods. Below the traders were the peasants and the soldiers. Aztec people could be enslaved as well, usually because they did not pay their debts or were being punished for crimes. Besides being used for labor, enslaved people were also offered up as sacrifices in religious ceremonies. The Aztecs had an interesting and very complex religion, and it was centered to their society. They worshipped an ever-evolving pantheon of hundreds of gods, many of whom were considered to have both female and male aspects. Worship among the Aztecs involved a great many rituals and feast days as well as human sacrifices. The Aztecs believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves in order to create the world. Thus, human sacrifice and bloodletting was a sort of repayment and atonement for human sin. Human sacrifice probably had a political component in the sense that it demonstrated the great might of the Aztec Empire in a very dramatic fashion. The number of human sacrifices may never be known. Much of the information about Aztec society comes from Spanish invaders, who may have exaggerated the extent of human sacrifice in order to make the Aztecs seem more deserving of conquest. Women played a very important role in the Aztec tribute system, since they wove the valuable cloth that local rulers demanded as part of regular tribute. As the demand for cloth tribute increased, an Aztec husband might obtain more than one wife in order to be able to pay the tribute. While most Aztec women worked in their homes, some became priestesses, some became midwives, healers, and even merchants. A few noblewomen worked as scribes or writers to female members of the royal families. Therefore, at least these few women knew how to read and how to write. The decline of the Aztec Empire is its own topic, honestly. You know, it had comparatively low level of technology, such, for instance, it lacked the wheel. It didn't use packed animals. It meant that agriculture was hard and inefficient for the population. The Aztecs' commitment to military victory and the constant desire for more human sacrifices induced the leadership to expand the empire beyond what it could reasonably control. Finally, the extraction from conquered people of tribute and sacrifice victims inspired more resentment than loyalty. Because of this resentment, many tribes ruled by the Aztecs were ready to rebel if they thought they had an opportunity to succeed. This opportunity comes when the Spaniards arrived in 1519. So in 1438, a tribal leader who called himself Pachacuti, which means transformer or shaker of the earth, began conquering the tribes living where is now Cusco, Peru. His military victories, followed by those of his son, combined the small tribes into a full-fledged empire called the Inca Empire. It extended from present-day Ecuador in the north to Chile in the south. In terms of government, in order to rule the extensive territory efficiently, the Inca Empire was split into 4 provinces, each with its own governor and bureaucracy. Conquered leaders who demonstrated loyalty to the empire were rewarded. In contrast to the people living under the Aztecs, conquered people under the Inca did not have to pay tribute. Rather, they were subject to something called the mita system, mandatory public service. Men between the ages of 15 and 50 provided agricultural and other forms of labor, including the construction of roads. For religion, the name Inca means people of the sun, and Inti, the sun god, was the most important of the Inca gods. Inca rulers were considered to be Inti's representation on earth. As the center of the 2 critical elements in the Inca religion, honoring of the sun and honoring the royal ancestor, the Temple of the Sun in Cusco formed the core of the Incan religion. Royal ancestor veneration was a practice intended to extend the rule of a leader. Dead rulers were mummified and continued to rule as they had in life, and were thought to retain ownership of their servants, possessions, and property. Thus, Inca rulers could not expect to inherit land or property upon assuming power. This practice was a partial motivator for the constant expansion of the empire. Priests were generally consulted before important actions. To the Inca, the gods controlled all things, and priests could determine the god's will by studying the arrangement of coca leaves in a dish or by watching the movement of a spider. Priests diagnosed illnesses, predicted the outcome of battles, they solved crimes, and determined what sacrifices should be made to which god. Serious events such as famines, plagues, and defeat in war called for human sacrifices. Although scholars do not believe that human sacrifice was practiced with the same frequency as it probably was with the Aztecs. Inca religion included some animism, which is the belief that the elements of the physical world could have supernatural powers. called huaca, they could have large geographical features such as a river or a mountain peak, or they could be very small objects such as a rock, a plant, or a built object such as a bridge. In mathematics, the Inca developed something called the cupu, a system of knotted strings used to record numerical information for trade and engineering and for recording messages to be carried throughout the empire. In agriculture, the Inca developed sophisticated terrace systems for the cultivation of crops such as potatoes and corn. The terraces utilized a technique called waru, or raised beds with channels that captured and redirected rain to avoid erosion during floods, and that also stored water to be used during dry periods. The Inca were especially good builders of bridges and roads. Using captive labor, they constructed a massive roadway system called the Carpanan, with some 25,000 miles of roads used mainly by the government and military. In a mountainous region, bridges were particularly important. The Inca declined upon the arrival of the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro in 1532. The Inca Empire was in the midst of a civil war of succession after the death of the last emperor. Some scholars believe that the civil war weakened the Inca army, making it easier for Spain's forces to prevail. Others believe that other factors such as diseases introduced by Europeans led to the decline. In 1533, the Spanish conquered the core of the empire, although outposts held out until 1572. Today, the Inca ruins at Machu Picchu are one of the most visited sites in the world. So historians debate how closely Mesoamerican cultures were related to one another. Many argue that most are based on the Olmec civilization, which rose up around 900 BCE in modern-day Mexico. Sometimes since, many centuries later, they still have the same features as the Olmecs. For example, the Olmecs had a feathered snake god that became fundamental in both Mayan and Aztec religion. The subjects depicted on Olmec pottery have been found in pottery in other civilizations. The Olmecs' ritual sacrifices, pyramids, and ball courts for their game they played were also continued in other cultures. Other historians argue that different cultures developed complex civilizations more or less independently.